Good evening, I'm Cynthia Ng. Our top story for tonight. Iran and Israel launch new waves of strikes as Tehran claims to have targeted Kurdish groups in Iraq. That and more coming up on AWANI International. Israel and Iran have launched new waves of strikes as the Middle East conflict enters day 6. Israel says it hit a missile launcher in Qom, with explosions also reported in Isfahan and across Tehran. Israel adds it is also striking Hezbollah infrastructure in Lebanon. Across the region, explosions are reported in Qatar and Bahrain. Azerbaijan says it was attacked by 2 Iranian drones, and a tanker is damaged in the northern Gulf, where Iran has claimed it had attacked an American ship. Inside Iran, more than 1,000 people have been killed since the US and Israel launched strikes over the weekend, according to a US based human rights agency. Iranian forces also claim that they have hit Kurdish groups in northern Iraq, spreading the conflict further across the region. There are reports that some Kurdish armed groups have consulted with the US on whether to strike Iranian forces, with American troops standing by to provide air support if they join the fight. The Iran conflict is rapidly turning into a global economic crisis. Energy markets, shipping lanes, and international air travel are already feeling the impact. Farhana Sheikh joins me now for more. Farhana, this escalation is sending shockwaves through the global system. Where is the impact being felt most right now?
You're definitely right, Cynthia. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy route, has become the epicenter of escalating tensions in the Middle East. Now, roughly 20% of the world's oil and LNG flows through Hormuz. Within the first 48 hours of the conflict, Brent crude surged from about $67 to about $80 per barrel and is now hovering around $84. Now, analysts warn that if the strait is fully blocked, oil could surge past $100 per barrel. That would not just raise fuel prices, analysts warn it would also push global inflation higher by nearly 1%. That's just oil and energy markets. Now, if we look at global shipping, at sea, commercial shipping has already slowed to a crawl. Major carriers like Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd had suspended transits through the Gulf, with hundreds of oil tankers sitting idle near Hormuz, unwilling to enter what has effectively become a contested zone. Now, some shipping companies are rerouting vessels away from the area, going around Africa and Asia, adding up to 14 days to transit times and sharply increasing fuel costs. There's also an active threat going on in Hormuz. Iran has positioned missiles along its coastline, with one ship already been hit off the coast of Oman. And despite the US saying its navy is ready to escort tankers through the strait, Tehran has vowed to target any ship attempting the crossing, so companies are just not willing to take the risk.
We're seeing ripple effects are hitting hard, not just shipping lanes and trading routes. Tens of thousands of travelers are still stranded across the Middle East as flights are cancelled, suspended, and this is largely due to the airspace closures across the Gulf. So just how severe is the disruption that we're seeing, Farna?
Right. So if we look at global travel and aviation, right, on March 1st alone, more than 20% of regional flights were cancelled, while thousands are more delayed as airlines rerouted around Iranian, Iraqi, and Jordanian airspace. Major aviation hubs like Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, some of the world's busiest transit airports, have seen widespread disruption. They normally handles about a quarter of the world's long-haul transit traffic, but that corridor has now been severely disrupted, pushing up ticket prices on alternative routes. Now, we have seen several global airlines, including Lufthansa, Singapore Airlines, and Cathay Pacific, have also suspended flights to the region. So this impacts everyone's travel. Either you're traveling to Canada up to Bali, right? So if we look at that, we have not again just aviation and travel. It doesn't stop there. The impacts of the crisis are being felt far and wide. For the Gulf and Asia, the economic impacts could escalate very quickly. Now, Dubai, for example, long seen as a safe financial and tourism hubs, are now facing growing investor anxiety after a 2-day shutdown of UAE stock exchanges and a 4.8% drop in Dubai's market when it reopens yesterday. Asia is also highly exposed. Countries such as China, India, Japan, and South Korea rely heavily on energy shipped through Hormuz. We look at the table here, Japan and South Korea. Japan is 95% or more than 90% total oil via Hormuz, and so is South Korea, India, and China slightly less. So there's definitely fear of an economic slowdown if supplies remain disrupted. The shock has also been amplified by a halt in Qatar's LNG exports, so removing roughly 20% of global LNG supply overnight. Gas prices in Europe and Asia have already jumped 40% in just 2 days, threatening manufacturing and industrial production across the region. Now, earlier, I talked to Stefan Ng from Moody's Analytics to discuss more about Asia's exposure to the conflict.
If you think about how this would impact Asia-Pacific economies, you can basically think of three groups because the impact would vary quite a bit across the region. I would put Asia's high-income economies at the top. So here I'm thinking of South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. Those sorts of economies, they import more than 80% of the energy they need domestically. In countries like Japan, Korea, that ratio goes to 90%. So when energy prices increase, that tends to raise domestic inflation. It weakens trade balances, which hurts the currencies. And it shows up in the economy very quickly. So that's one reason why we saw these big swings in the Korean equity market, for example, over the last couple of days. So those economies are very vulnerable. Then there is a second group of economies that are still vulnerable, but not quite as much as the first one. And here I'm thinking of China, India, for example. They are not quite as vulnerable in the sense that they don't import quite as much energy relative to domestic consumption, but they do get a lot of the energy that they need from the region that is affected by the disruptions. So China, India, they buy a lot of oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. So they have to figure out how to manage the situation now. They have reserves to tide them over the most significant disruption. But if this whole thing drags on, they would, of course, be in a pinch, right? So they would also suffer. And then there's a third group of economies that might even benefit a little bit at the margin. And those tend to be economies that export commodities. That includes Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia. Those economies tend to benefit from higher commodity prices, and commodity prices they correlate, so they go up overall. And when they do go up, that lifts export revenues, government revenues, etc., which tends to benefit the economy indirectly. But generally, it's not that big a help when the rest of the world is suffering. So, I would perhaps keep the champagne on ice.
Not every country is exposed in the same way from this conflict, from what we're saying. So, Rana, for countries heavily reliant on Middle East energy, how are they managing the risk? How should they be managing the risk from here?
Well, Cynthia, Stefan says the assumption now is that the conflict is temporary and the impacts should be manageable. But that said, Stefan did share how ASEAN economies should navigate this uncertain period. Let's hear what he has to say.
I think the commodity price shock certainly increases upside risk for inflation outcomes, which across Asia are mostly look pretty contained. But we know that central banks across the region are already pretty concerned with weakness of currencies, with asset valuations. So now having the potential for reaccelerating inflation on top of that would certainly cause them to move cautiously with regard to monetary policy change. The central banks that were looking to ease policy, they're going to do that more gradually from here on out. And the same would be true for fiscal policy, to the extent that fiscal policy can help cushion these sorts of shocks.
Thank you, Farhana, for the latest development on the Iranian conflict. We'll be back with more after the break.
Suatu operasi khas pihak berkuasa hari ini membangun pada penangkapan seorang lelaki, Muhammad Mahdi Iman, yang dikenali sebagai Walid.
Astro yang sesat sekarang ni, Umi? Umi ataupun Walid? Walid nak dia keluar daripada jihad rumah.
Stream Wallet dan banyak lagi hanya dengan RM4.99 sebulan. Add-on View Premium melalui My Astro app.
Welcome back. A bipartisan resolution to limit President Donald Trump's powers to wage war in Iran has failed in the U.S. Senate. The measure was rejected in a 53-47 vote, mostly along party lines. If it had passed, Congress would have had to approve any further military action against Iran.
Under the War Powers Act, the President has broad authority to order military action, but Congress must be notified within 48 hours of hostilities beginning. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the Trump administration complied with that requirement. Democrats say Trump has sidelined Congress, giving inconsistent justifications for his actions. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the war could last up to 8 weeks, double the time frame previously estimated by Trump. The legislation now heads to the House, where it faces more political hurdles. Trump has previously ordered strikes without congressional approval, including attacks on Iranian targets last year and the seizure of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in January.
The United States says it is working on a plan to secure the Strait of Hormuz and protect all tankers during the ongoing conflict with Iran. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt says the Defense and Energy departments are coordinating closely with President Donald Trump on that plan.
Leavitt did not provide details on timing or possible military operations. Her comments come as Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claims it maintains full control of the strait despite rising tension. The strategic waterway is one of the world's busiest shipping routes and a critical gateway for Gulf oil and gas exports. Global crude prices have climbed after US and Israeli strikes on Iran disrupted tanker movements over the weekend. Earlier, Trump said the US Navy could escort oil tankers through the strait if additional protection is needed.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is warning Moscow could halt gas supplies to Europe. He says the conflict involving Iran and Western restrictions on Russian oil are pushing global energy prices higher.
Putin also floated the idea of redirecting more gas to emerging markets instead of Europe, but stressed no final decision has been made. Global oil and gas prices have risen sharply after US and Israeli strikes on Iran triggered retaliatory Iranian attacks across the Gulf. Just a few years ago, Russia supplied about 40% of the EU's pipeline gas. Last year, that figure stood at around 6%. Algeria, Norway, and the US have since stepped in as some of Europe's main energy suppliers.
China has set its slowest growth target since 1991, 4.5% to 5%, a sign the economic engine that powered the country's rise is starting to strain. Now, this is the first formal downgrade for the world's second largest economy since 2023.
Premier Li Qiang made the announcement at China's annual parliamentary gathering. The lower target reflects China's slowdown, driven in part by the collapse of its property sector. The country is also facing deflationary pressures, weak consumer confidence, and the aftermath of US tariffs and trade tensions. Beijing is trying to move from manufacturing and exports to a focus on consumption and high-tech industry. It is aiming for more self-reliance as tensions with Washington grow. China also plans to boost defense spending by 7%, the lowest rate in 5 years, but still higher than much of the region.
That concludes AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Cynthia Ng. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting.